In the previous video, we looked at a few ways to prototype a level. For this project, we'll use the modeling toolkit. To open it, go to the Select Mode drop-down at the top and switch it to Modeling. This will bring up a new panel on the side. For now, I'm going to close the content browser so we have a bit more workspace. As you can see, the modeling toolkit gives us a range of tools and options. We won't go through every single one, just the key tools we need to start building and setting up our level. Let's start by adding a box shape to our level. Click on the box tool. Once selected, a settings panel appears with some options. If you move your cursor into the scene, you'll see a preview of the box before it's placed. Before placing it, you can adjust its size using the initial settings in the panel. This lets you control how large the box will be in the world. We want our walls to be 4 meters wide. This comes directly from the level layout we planned earlier, where one grid unit equals 4 meters. That size is a common standard when building modular pieces. If you're wondering why I'm using these values, it's because I'm following the level design document we prepared alongside the project. Let's go to the settings and adjust the dimensions. Set the width to 400. Keep in mind Unreal Engine uses centimeters, so 400 cm equals 4 meters. For the depth, we'll keep it very thin at 10, then set the height to 400 as well so the wall stays a perfect square shape. As you adjust the values, you'll notice the preview mesh updates in real time inside the viewport. Once you're happy with the size, just click in the level to place it. That will drop the object into your scene. You can keep clicking to add more walls, but for now we'll stop here and hit complete. Now let's see how this mesh was actually created. Open the content drawer again and dock it back into the layout. If you look inside the content drawer, you'll notice a new folder called Generated. Open that folder, then go into the subfolder with my name. Inside, you'll find a newly created static mesh asset. You can identify it as a static mesh from the label in its name. My assets are marked with a light blue color. If you hover over one, the pop-up at the top shows its name along with its type. You'll notice a box with a long generated name followed by static mesh. That confirms it's a static mesh asset. This is what makes the modeling toolkit so useful. It lets us create and edit static meshes directly inside the editor, something that wasn't possible in earlier versions of Unreal. If you don't like the way the files are organized, you can change it. Since I'm working alone, I don't really need a separate per-user folder, and I'm not a fan of the default naming either. So first, I'll remove it from the level, then delete the asset itself. After that, I'll clean up and remove the extra folders as well before creating a new setup. To change that, we need to adjust how the folders are being created. Go into Project Settings. Instead of browsing through everything manually, just use the search bar and type Generated. Scroll down until you find the Modeling Mode settings under the Plugins section. These are the options that control things like where files are saved and how the folders are structured. Here, focus on the Auto-Generated Asset Path option. This is what controls the folder name that gets created automatically. If we want our generated meshes to go into a different folder, we just change this path. For example, I'll rename it to MeshGen. You can set it to whatever naming style works best for your project. Here, focus on the Auto-Generated Asset Path option. This is what controls the folder name that gets created automatically. If we want our generated meshes to go into a different folder, we just change this path. For example, I'll rename it to MeshGen. You can set it to whatever naming style works best for your project. We can leave that as it is. Another important option here is Use Per User Auto-Gen subfolder. This is what creates a separate folder with your username when it's enabled. Since I'm not working in a team, I don't really need that. If I turn it off, all newly generated meshes will be saved directly inside the MeshGen folder instead of being split into user-based subfolders. With the subfolder option disabled, everything will now stay in a single folder. The last setting here is Append Random String to Name. This one is optional. You can keep it on or turn it off depending on your preference. If you remember, our wall piece was named something like box followed by a random mix of letters and numbers. That extra part is exactly what this setting controls. This is the setting right here. You can turn it off if you find those random names annoying or prefer to rename things manually, but I usually keep it enabled as a safety check. It helps avoid duplicate file names, which Unreal doesn't handle well. That's also why we use prefixes like SM, since a single asset or concept can have multiple related file types, and this keeps everything clearly separated. For example, you might have a static mesh of a phone and also an audio file for a phone ringtone. Both belong to the same phone asset, but they are different types of files. That's why we use prefixes like SM for static meshes. It helps keep everything organized and makes it clear what each asset is, even when they share the same base name. For audio, you might use a prefix like SFX for sound effects, so you could have something like SFX phone ring while the static mesh would be SM phone. Both share the same base name, but the prefixes keep them unique and clearly organized. This setup has worked reliably for me, and it helps avoid naming conflicts. Without it, if you tried to give multiple generated meshes the same name, you could run into errors or overwriting issues. Since this is still an experimental feature, it can sometimes cause issues or even crashes, so I'm going to leave this option enabled for now. Once you're done adjusting the settings, just confirm them. Now if I create another box wall, you'll see it keeps the same settings I used before. When I drag it into the scene, it already comes in with the correct shape and dimensions. So I'll click to place it, then hit complete. Now you'll see a new folder has been created called MeshGen, and there's no per user subfolder anymore. Our box is stored directly inside it. Next, I'm going to rename the asset. In Unreal, you can do this by right-clicking and choosing Rename, or simply pressing F2. I'll name this Wall 4 so it clearly represents the 4-meter wall piece. Now we can easily tell what this asset is just by looking at the name. As a quick side note, this is optional, but since I spend a lot of time in Unreal, I like keeping things visually consistent. It can be distracting when the thumbnail preview isn't oriented properly. I'll fix that quickly by going into the settings and enabling thumbnail edit mode. Once it's on, you'll see a small blue indicator appear. This lets you adjust the asset preview directly. Now I can rotate the thumbnail so it's properly aligned, making it much easier to scan through assets at a glance. Right now, we only have one piece, but as your project grows, having clear and readable previews becomes really useful when managing lots of assets. Once you're finished, just click Done to exit thumbnail edit mode, and everything is set. Another powerful feature of the modeling toolkit is that it lets us adjust the pivot point of static meshes directly inside Unreal. This is something new. Before, you couldn't do this at all in the engine. In the past, you had to export the mesh to another program just to change the pivot. That meant changing the pivot, importing it back in, and then readjusting everything based on the new pivot position. For this piece, I want the pivot to sit in the corner, more specifically aligned with this edge so it stays flush. To do that, we have a lot of options available here, and we'll go over a few of the important ones. But for now, we'll only focus on the tools we actually need for prototyping, so it doesn't get overwhelming. Scroll down to the Transform section and click Pivot. This gives you a special gizmo different from the standard transform controls. From here, you can either manually move the pivot by dragging it into place or quickly snap it using one of the built-in presets. For example, if the pivot is sitting in the wrong spot but you want it centered on the wall, you can just click Center and it will snap there instantly. In my case, I actually want it in the corner. I'm spending a bit of time on pivots because they become really important when you start using grid snapping and building things modularly. We already covered how to adjust the grid size and how Unreal's grid system helps keep everything aligned properly, preventing gaps between walls and issues like light leaking through. But for grid snapping to work correctly, it actually uses the pivot point as its reference. That means the position of the pivot determines how your mesh aligns to the grid. So we need to place the pivot in the correct position. Right now, you can see it overlaps 2 grid squares, which means it won't align properly. To fix that, I'll press OK, and now the pivot has snapped over to one side of the wall. Now I can drag it down and make sure it's perfectly flush with this edge. You'll notice the pivot movement follows the grid snapping, so as long as snapping is enabled, you can place it exactly where you need it. I'm going to move it into this corner so the pivot lines up cleanly with the grid lines. Now it's sitting exactly on the corner point. Once I'm happy with it, I can press Accept. But if I move it now and it still doesn't line up perfectly with the grid, that's because it's snapping in steps of 10 from its current position. To fix that and align it properly with the world grid, just make sure the object is selected first. Then hold Ctrl and press the key above the arrow keys next to Delete. This forces it to snap cleanly to the world grid. You'll see it immediately lock into place, perfectly aligned with the grid lines. Now the wall piece is properly set up. From here, you can hold Alt to duplicate it, and you don't even need to stay in modeling mode for that. You only need modeling mode for setting the pivot. After that, you can leave it if you just want to duplicate pieces. Now I'll hold Alt and drag out another wall to create a copy. If we look back at our level map, we can see how this starts to come together. The solid black lines in the top-down layout represent the wall pieces we're now placing in the scene. This is exactly why drawing your level to scale is so important. It makes this whole prototyping stage much faster. Instead of guessing or trial and error for room size, I can simply follow the grid. For room 1, I just counted out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So this wall needs to be 5 of our 4-meter units long along what I'm calling the north side. Now, Unreal doesn't really have a true north direction, it's just a virtual space, so you define orientation however you want. But to keep things consistent and easy to read, I'm using this top-down view as my reference. From this angle, you can clearly see the walls running top to bottom, which I'll treat as north to south. To keep everything consistent and avoid ending up with a rotated layout later, we need to make sure our direction matches this top-down plan. This is mostly personal preference. You can orient it differently if you want, but I want the final top-down view to line up exactly with our reference map. So I'm going to use our character for alignment, not the player start, though we'll adjust that as well. I'll select our scale reference character first, then I'll press E to switch to the rotation tool. Since this actor has a camera attached, selecting it also gives a small camera preview, which is really useful. Now I'll rotate the character to line everything up properly. Now it's facing south, matching the intended direction for the character. So when I switch back to perspective view, everything is clear. This side is north, this is south, with east and west defined accordingly. I'm going to rotate the walls to match this setup. It doesn't really matter where I start placing them, since this floor isn't part of the final level, we're just using it for layout and planning. We're going to build our own floors later, but for now we'll keep this in place so everything stays on the same level and is easier to reference. This also helps make sure grid snapping stays consistent across the scene. Now, remembering what we counted earlier, this wall section needs to be 5 units wide. I'll hold Alt and drag out additional copies until I have a 3rd, 4th, and 5th wall piece. All of these are still instances of the same original wall asset, so they're linked together. For example, if I apply a grid material here, it helps me read the scale more clearly and understand how everything is fitting together. I don't actually need to apply that to each wall one by one. Instead, I can just double-click the wall in the content browser to open it in the static mesh editor. From here, I can adjust the material settings using the material slot. I'll search for grid to find a suitable material. These grid materials come from the third-person template, so I'll set it to a gray grid option and hit save. After closing the editor, you'll see the change apply to every wall automatically since they're all using the same asset. Now we've got our wall piece ready, let's quickly check our asset list to see what else we need next. Let's scroll down to the Environment Assets section, since that's what we're focused on right now. We already have a wall, and next we need a ceiling piece, also sized at 4 meters. You might think we could just duplicate the wall and rotate it to act as a ceiling, and that would work for now. But instead, we want to create a separate ceiling asset. This keeps it as its own reference, which will make things much easier later when we replace these prototype pieces with final art. We're going to switch back into modeling mode and select the box tool. You'll notice it has kept our previous dimensions, which is helpful. We could reuse this shape and rotate it, but then we'd have to adjust the pivot again, so it's not ideal. Instead, I'll keep the width at 400, set the depth to 400, and reduce the height to 10. Now when we hover over the scene, you can see it's oriented correctly. If you want, you can also skip adding the material later in the static mesh editor and just apply it directly from the initial setup settings. I'll click to place it, then hit complete. Now we have a separate ceiling asset created as its own reference. I'll press F2 and rename it to Ceiling 4M so it's clearly identified. Right now, the pivot is sitting in the center of the mesh, which can be useful depending on what you're building. But for this setup, I want it to snap cleanly to the grid instead. So I'm going to change the pivot position to the left side. Then I'll drag the pivot into position and line it up with the grid lines. Once that looks correct, I'll verify it's snapped to the world grid by holding Ctrl and snapping it into place. And it is, everything is aligned properly. Now our ceiling piece is ready to use. As we start building this out, you might notice that using the same material everywhere can get a bit confusing. So for clarity, I'm going to tweak the material slightly, nothing major, just a simple color change to help differentiate the pieces. But I still want to keep the grid lines visible. To change the color while preserving that, we'll need to create a new material. First, I need to find the current grid material I applied. I could dig through the folders, but an easier way is to just select the mesh itself. I'll open the Details panel, and under Materials, you can see the current assignment is the Prototype Grid Gray material. To quickly locate it in the content browser, I can click the small magnifying glass icon next to it. This will automatically jump straight to the material asset. We'll go much deeper into materials later when we start building final assets. For now, during prototyping, we'll just duplicate this gray material and tweak the color slightly. So I'll right-click it, choose Duplicate, and rename the copy to something like Gray 1. Now I'm going to change it to a different color. Let's go with red. You can pick any color you want. I'll double-click the material instance to open it. Just remember, a material instance is different from the main parent material. We'll go into more detail on that later, but for now, just make sure your window looks like this. If you open the material and it looks like this, then you're editing the parent material. We don't want that during this prototyping stage. Make sure you're working with a material instance instead. To change the color, just go to the surface color parameter. Click the color bar and pick a new color. You can also adjust the grid line color if you want, like switching it to white, but I'll leave it as it is. Now we have a red version of the grid material ready. Next, I'll go into the MeshGen folder where both the wall and ceiling assets are stored. I'll open the wall asset and switch its material from Prototype Grid Gray to the red version. This updates the default look for all wall instances, so everything using that mesh will now appear red. Just keep in mind, you can still override the material per instance if needed. So if one specific wall needs a different color, you can change it without affecting the rest while still using the same mesh. Or I can just select a specific wall in the level and change its material directly in the viewport. Since I've updated the default material in the static mesh editor, anytime I reset or go back to default, it will use whatever is set there. So from here, I'm going to continue building out more pieces like floors and platforms using the same workflow we used for the ceiling and walls. First, I'm going to update the ceiling material the same way we did for the walls. I'll go into the Materials folder, take the red material we just created and duplicate it. You can right-click and duplicate it or just press Ctrl+D. Now I'll rename this new one and open it by double-clicking it so we can change its color to blue. I'll set this one to a blue color. Also, instead of opening things manually and searching for them, there's a faster way to find assets. If you select an object in the level and press Ctrl+B, Unreal will automatically jump to that asset in the content browser. I'll double-click it and set the default material to blue. You might notice it doesn't update immediately on the mesh in the level. That's normal. To fix it, just hit the reset button and it will pull in the new default value we just set in the static mesh editor. Alright, let's keep going and create the remaining pieces we'll need. Next up are the floor pieces. They should match the same size as this current wall segment. Even though we could just reuse and rotate what we already have, we still want a separate asset reference for the floor so everything stays organized later. We could also go back into modeling mode, add another box, and repeat the same steps we used for the ceiling. But since we already have the correct shape, we can speed things up. I'll select the ceiling piece, hold Alt, and drag a copy down to the floor. Right now, both of these are still using the same Ceiling 4M asset. Now we can separate them using the modeling toolkit. I'll select the duplicated floor piece, then go into the modeling mode panel on the side. Under the Create section, I'll choose Mesh Duplicate. At first, it doesn't look like much changes, but you'll see the same kind of setup options appear that we had when creating a new primitive shape. I'll rename it to something like Floor 4M instead of keeping the ceiling name. I'll leave the output type set to from input, so it stays the same kind of object as the original mesh I duplicated. For handle input, I'll keep it on delete, then click Accept. Now I have a new Floor 4M asset with a unique identifier, so it's a separate reference from the ceiling. This is where the Append Random String to Name setting comes into play. Even though I named it Floor 4M, Unreal still adds that random string at the end. It's just a safety feature to prevent naming conflicts, so if another asset already had the same name, it won't overwrite or collide with it. Basically, it ensures every asset stays uniquely identified in memory and avoids errors caused by duplicate names. We can leave that as is, it's not strictly needed for this setup. Now I'm going to create a separate material for the floor so we can color code the level layout. The idea is simple. Walls will be red, ceilings will be blue, and I'll assign a new color for the floor pieces green. You can choose any colors you like, this green works fine for me. Once that's set, I'll close the material window and move on to the next step. Now I'll open the floor static mesh in the editor. From there, I can update its default material. If I need to, I can use the search bar to quickly find the right material among everything in the project. I've searched for green, and only one material shows up with that name. That's the one I'll use. Since this mesh was already placed, the last step is just to reset the material value so it updates properly. And that's everything I need for now to start building the level. I still need a few more pieces before the prototype is fully complete, but we'll handle those as we go. For now, I'm going to pause here. In the next part, we'll start building out the first pass of the level. See you in the next video.